Hi, I'm Bob Christopher, and this is Basic Gospel Answers. We have a great question today. It is this: is divorce okay for a Christian? And boy, is this a relevant question today in our current culture. Well, it was relevant back in Jesus' day as well, and some Pharisees came to Jesus and posed a question on divorce to try to test him. And here's how they framed it. They said, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Well, here's how Jesus answered that. He said, haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female? So they were asking, based on the law, could they still be justified under the law and divorce their wives? Jesus just bypassed the law and went back to the very beginning. And he said that the Creator, and that was him himself, made them male and female. And he said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh, and therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate. So what do we learn in Jesus' answer? We learn three things about marriage. First, that it's God ordained, that God invented marriage, that He made humanity, male and female, so that they could come together and become one flesh. So it's God ordained. The second thing that we learn in Jesus' answer is that it's a sacred union. The two become one. And we've lost that sacred sense in our culture today. It's just a casual relationship. Two people coming together, living in the same household, trying to get along, and if they don't, they decide, hey, let's just move on. They've never come to grips with the fact that marriage is the union of two people in such a way that they identify with one another and become one flesh. So marriage is a sacred union, and because of this, it's permanent. It should never be dissolved except by death. Now, the Pharisees listened, and you could just see that their minds were spinning, and they're like, what about? What about? And so they go back to the law. So Jesus went to the beginning, and these Pharisees were staying with the law. They wanted the legal answer to their question. So why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? So this was a provision in the law. If somebody found something wrong with their wife, then they could write a certificate of divorce and send her away, divorce her. And that freed her to remarry. That maintained her status in the community and gave her an opportunity to remarry without being labeled an adulterer. So Moses provided for that, and they were asking, why did he do that? Well, Jesus answered, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. That's why divorce happens in this world today, because of the hardness of heart. We live in a fallen world. We live in a flesh that is fallen and has desires that are opposed to God. And so things are going to happen in relationships. We're going to grow cold toward one another. But that's not the way it was from the beginning. And that's what Jesus wants us to understand as believers in Christ. We can't look at marriage through the lens of law and the Mosaic covenant. We're no longer under the law. We are under the grace of God. So we want to be taken back to the very beginning and see how God ordained marriage from the start. And as we said, it's a sacred union and it's permanent. So that's what we need to have in our minds as believers in Christ. So Jesus goes on to say, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality, and that's the exception, sexual immorality, and marries another woman commits adultery. And that's exactly what those Pharisees were doing. They got tired of their current wives. They found someone else that they wanted to marry, so they used the loophole. They used the provision in the Old Covenant, wrote the certificate of divorce just so that they could marry another woman. And Jesus said that's nothing more than adultery. So let's look at marriage. So Jesus went back to the very beginning. Paul too goes back to the very beginning, and he explains marriage like this, that it's a mystery. So this is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. So he uses the very words that Jesus used, and Jesus used the very words that were from the beginning, that a man shall leave his father and mother and will cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Now, Paul relates this to Christ and the church. So marriage has a profound purpose. It's more than just creating a family unit and for the continuation of the species. It has a grander purpose, and that purpose is to reflect the very love of Christ for the church. So Christians that marry and become one, they are identified with one another. They're in union with one another, just as Christ is with the church. And when we live out our Christian marriage, we reflect the love of Christ for His church out there in the world. So, however, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. That's what makes a Christian marriage work. The fact that a husband loves his wife as Christ loved the church, and a wife respects her husband in all things. Now, this marriage that we have, we're going to go through conflicts, we're going to go through tough times, and it's in those tough times that this message of reconciliation, this story of reconciliation, really needs to be the foundation for how we move forward in the relationship. Now in 2 Corinthians 5 we see this, all this is from God who reconciled us to Himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation, that God was reconciling the world to Himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. And He has committed to us the message of reconciliation. So in a marriage, in a Christian marriage where there's a Christian man, a Christian woman, they've become one flesh, when the marriage goes through some rough patches, this ministry of reconciliation needs to undergird that marriage, to lift it up and enable them to see that, hey, they can be reconciled. They can put their differences aside and come together even stronger than before. Now, I want to make one point here before we move away from this particular slide, that Christ reconciled the world through His shed blood. And as a result, He's not counting sins against us. Now, there are many people that are going to be listening to this who have been divorced, and they may be suffering from guilt and shame and wondering what God is going to do as a result of that divorce. Well, first, know this: divorce is not the unpardonable sin, that Christ took upon that sin in His body 2,000 years ago, and as a result, He is not counting that against you today. So rejoice that forgiveness is yours. You don't have to live in guilt and shame anymore. You can rejoice that Christ has already done something about that sin, and that in Him you can experience forgiveness of sins. So Paul takes this theme, and in his chapter on marriage, 1 Corinthians 7, he says this: to the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband. So that's the command of the Lord. So is it okay for a Christian to divorce? Well, Christians are going to get divorced, and if they do, there's forgiveness for that divorce. It's in Christ Jesus. If they're in Christ, they already have that forgiveness of sins. But here's what God is going to say. If you're going through a rough patch, wife, don't separate from the husband. And he says if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. There's great hope with Jesus. Jesus is the very one that holds this world together, and Jesus is the one that holds our marriages together. And Jesus is the one that will draw us to this point of wanting to be reconciled one to another. So if you're struggling in your marriage today, let the story of reconciliation become your story in your marriage so that you can actually reflect the love of Christ for His church out there in the world today. Hi, I'm Bob Christopher. Thanks for joining us on this edition of Basic Gospel Answers. We'll have a new video up next week, next Thursday at 10 o'clock. So be sure and subscribe, like, and ring the bell so that you'll be notified when the next edition of Basic Gospel Answers is coming your way. We'll see you next time.